Hello, my name is Elizabeth McClain, and I'm an attorney with Farmworker Legal Services, or FLS for short. FLS is a statewide program that offers free legal services to migrant farm workers and their families. We offer a broad range of services relating to employment issues, so whether that be pay issues, employer-provided housing, discrimination, things along those lines. So I'm here today to talk about labor trafficking. So what does labor trafficking look like in Michigan? What have I seen? Well, in order to talk about labor trafficking, we first want to start with the definition of labor trafficking. The definition is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of subjugation to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So those are a lot of words, and to break it down, I think it's easiest for me to talk about examples. In Michigan, some of the types of cases of labor trafficking that I've seen firsthand include the paying of what's called recruitment fees, or otherwise an employer paying costs upfront for a worker in order to get that worker to come to the job. What happens is a lot of the times workers will arrive thinking that all of those costs were paid for because the employer has stated as such. But in reality, when they receive their first paycheck, employers start taking out money from their pay stubs in order to recoup those costs in a way. Another type that we've seen have been, false promises of employment, whether that be, pay wage or their housing situation. So workers will be told, hey, I'm going to pay you $15 an hour. There's going to be free housing. They'll be providing X, Y, and Z. And so workers rely on that promise. And then once they arrive in Michigan, they are being told, yeah, no, I'm not. That's actually not what's going to happen. You're already here. You're going to work for me. And that's where those fraud, force, and coercion words that we were talking about earlier come in. Another type of situation that we've seen a lot of is where employers will use threats of immigration or law enforcement as a way of controlling and causing fear for workers. So that can be, hey, I know you're here. I know you don't have legal documentation to be in the United States. So you're going to work for me and you're going to do what I say, or I'm going to call immigration enforcement on you. Additionally, sometimes employers will have the employees do an illegal act as part of that employment and then hold it over the employee's head of, hey, you did this illegal act, you're going to keep doing it, or you're going to keep doing what I say, or I'm going to call the cops. And that in itself comes back to those fraud, force, and coercion as well. Another type of situation that we've seen a lot of is where an employer will take important documents from workers that can be important immigration documents like visas, legal permanent resident cards or green cards. It can be general important documents like driver's license, passports, plane tickets, bus tickets. And often what you hear when you hear these stories are, well, the employer said that they were keeping it for safekeeping, to make sure that it didn't get lost. In reality, it's a form of control. They're keeping your documents hostage in order to keep you hostage to keep you working. Another way that we've seen labor trafficking occur in Michigan is through isolation. So, as I mentioned before, in my line of work, I work a lot with migrant farm workers. A lot of the migrant camps are actually located back in the middle of nowhere. And so that in itself creates that isolation. But I had one case in particular where workers were actually bussed out to the farms during the day. As soon as they returned home, they were padlocked in. So they couldn't leave and nobody could enter to see them. They couldn't have social service workers, healthcare workers, legal workers. Nobody was allowed to access these workers. And that super form of isolation can be used as a coercive or similar type of tool. So talking about those scenarios, that brings to mind a lot of myths that you might have heard or that are just spread around in general about labor trafficking. One of those myths is that Well, if I'm being paid for my work, then I can't be a victim of human trafficking, labor trafficking. That's not correct. You can still be receiving payment, but as I mentioned before, if that employer is taking money away from you, that can be sufficient. Another myth that is spread a lot is that, well, human traffickers can only be large companies or corporations or criminal organizations. That's also incorrect. Any person can be considered a trafficker. All that matters and all that's looked for is whether that person either received compensation for the trafficking or otherwise benefited from the services of those trafficked persons. So, who are the victims of human trafficking? Anybody can be a victim of labor trafficking. They can be male, female, children. It doesn't matter what your race or your nationality is. Anybody can be a victim. That also brings to mind a lot of myths that occur around labor trafficking and human trafficking in general. One of those myths is that, well, U.S. citizens and those that are legally in the United States can't be trafficking victims. That's incorrect. Any person, regardless of their immigration status, can be a victim of human trafficking, especially labor trafficking. Another myth that you hear a lot is that, well, if I'm within the U.S. and I'm being brought from one state to another, that's not labor trafficking because I wasn't brought from outside the U.S. That's also not a requirement of labor trafficking. You can be brought from across the border to the U.S. You can be brought across, another state line in the U.S. Both of those instances can be human trafficking or labor trafficking. So what makes people vulnerable to labor trafficking? There's a bunch of factors. You can have one factor, you can have interlocking factors. It just depends. So a lot of the factors that can come into play are, as I mentioned before, immigration status. It can be your socioeconomic status. It can also be the transitory nature of certain groups of people. As I mentioned, I work with farm workers. Farm work in itself is a very transitory type of job that can cause, being unfamiliar with the geographic location where workers find themselves, not knowing the resources to access or how to seek help necessarily. Those that move with regularity, those that are living at housing that is owned or operated by their employer, and also depending on their employer for transportation. A lot of workers might not have, their own car or other means to be able to access services. All of those can contribute to what makes someone more vulnerable to becoming a victim of labor trafficking. So what can youth do in order to not become a victim of labor trafficking? Well, I'd say that the first thing is be aware of your surroundings. Be aware of what is happening. Do not let an employer take your important documents. Do not pay an employer to receive a job. Just kind of pay attention to those examples that I laid out earlier. Don't let an employer take away or otherwise isolate you. So if you have a phone or a tablet, don't willingly hand that over to your employer in order to keep that job. If something seems off, it probably is, and reach out to help in the number that I'm going to be mentioning here in a second. So what should youth do if they suspect labor trafficking? Well, as I mentioned, being aware of your surroundings. But if you do think that you might be in a situation that could potentially be a form of labor trafficking, there is the National Human Trafficking Resource Hotline. Their number is 888-373-7888. You can call that number. They'll be able to give you some advice. They'll be able to connect you with the resources in your area, whether that be law enforcement, legal services, other support services that are needed. If you think that you might be in imminent danger or that someone might be in imminent danger, you can always call 911 in the meantime as well. Is there anything else that I would like you to know? Do not be afraid to seek help. If you, your family member, a friend, anybody, if you think that they might be a victim of labor trafficking, reach out for help. Call that national hotline number. Call a legal services agency. Call anyone. Just feel that you have those options available to you. Finally, I hope that none of you ever find yourselves in a labor trafficking situation. But should it occur, I hope that this video has been able to help you at least see some of the warning signs and be able to spot them should they occur. Thank you for your time and have a great day.